Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
The pandemic has accelerated humanity's move towards a virtual existence, where we spend more and more of our time online. In this new world, social media platforms are playing an increasingly central role in our lives. But these platforms are a double-edged sword, as we've seen in the last few years. As amazing as they are, we should, as savvy consumers, understand what really goes on under the hood and how it impacts us individually and as a society. Joining me today for a deeper look at these platforms is Sinan Aral, professor at MIT, where he co-heads MIT's initiative on the digital economy. He is a scientist, entrepreneur, and investor, and the founding partner of Manifest Capital. Sinan is the author of The Hype Machine, which is a great read. It combines science and Tom Clancy, narrating the impacts of these platforms to a collection of riveting stories. Sinan, welcome to Brave New World.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into our conversation about social media and The Hype Machine, tell us something personal that no one knows about you.
That's a very good question. I would say that one thing that you won't find on my resume, but that I plan to put on my resume after this year is second grade teacher. With my son, doing virtual school at home, I have a brand new appreciation for the brave men and women who educate our young ones out there. It has really been rewarding, but also eye-opening to be at home with a 7-year-old who is going to school every day right in front of me, and to see sort of exactly what he does every single day to get the questions directly in real time from him about the math and the art and the science and the reading and writing that he's doing, and just to see sort of every little detail of progress that he's making and setbacks as well. And so, my humble praise goes out to all of the educators of our young ones out there, because it's been fascinating to watch for sure.
Wow, how times have changed, haven't they? Right?
Yeah.
Where you can actually watch your kids learning from home. I bet he'll grow up and have some interesting things to say about this later in life.
I'm sure he'll probably tell me that I'm the one that held him back. But, it has been a unique experience to be able to watch it. And I was also a first grade teacher last year in the spring semester. So I've seen him finish out his first grade and start his second grade all on virtual education. And it has been eye-opening and rewarding. And we live in strange times, that's for sure.
We do indeed. Weren't you also a soccer coach pre-COVID?
Yeah, I'm his soccer coach. I also coach the chess team at his school, and I'm also the president of the Parents Association.
How about that?
Yeah. So I'm fully committed. I'm leaning in.
Yeah, you're all in here. Awesome. Sinan, like I said, I really enjoyed reading your book, and let's just dive straight into it, because I've got so many questions I want to ask. But I guess the one high-level question I have is, and there's several variants of this, is to what extent are we being manipulated by AI without even being aware of it, right? But to what extent is that the case?
Yeah, I think that it has seeped into the everyday of our daily life now. And I think that it's no more apparent than, for instance, in social media. So we know that social media is one of the most important channels through which we get our news, through which we get our understanding of what's happening in the lives of our friends and family and colleagues. And remember, there's so many different platforms. We have professional platforms like LinkedIn. We have, family and friend platforms like Facebook. We have much more wide-ranging platforms like Twitter, which could be considered more of a microblogging platform. I also write about in my book the way that they are even directing our evolution, in the sense that they are primarily responsible for the recommendations that are made in these dating apps that are being used to form new relationships. And it may be surprising for your listeners to hear that relationships formed by algorithm recommendation on dating apps surpassed traditional means of meeting one another in romantic relationships in 2013. So a full 7-8 years now, algorithms have been primarily responsible for the romantic relationships that are being formed in society. And the first question that comes to my mind when I think about that is, what does that mean for the gene pool? How is that different than the gene pool we would have gotten if we continued the traditional meeting and greeting of romantic relationships that existed before that? And what does that mean for the future of human evolution? How is human society going to be different because algorithms are deciding who is mating with whom now in greater proportion since 2013 than human beings are deciding? And so when it comes to news, when it comes to professional, when it comes to social information about friends and family, and even dating, algorithms play such a large role in what we know, who we meet, and what we buy, who we date, and what we decide, that I think it's really important to get under the hood about how these algorithms work. And I'll stop there and have a conversation about it, but I'll just say, in order to understand whether they're manipulating us, and I'm sure we will, we need to get under the hood of how they work. And that really is sort of the really fascinating story that I try to tell in my book.
So before we get to how they work, let's just push that a little further, what you were just talking about. Do we have any idea how that's working out for us?
We don't know yet. I haven't seen any real studies about what the differences are in, for instance, the romantic relationships that are formed now through algorithm compared to traditional meeting. But we have had some studies of, dating online that show that the design choices that go into how the dating platforms and the algorithms are written and coded actually make a big difference in terms of the matches that are created and the success with which people go into dating and so on. And so it is changing things. And the question is, how is it changing things? We still don't know. We're essentially flying blind on the larger societal consequences.
So is this new world being shaped by the design choices of engineers, where they say, let's try out this algorithm and see what happens, whether it evokes a certain type of response or an emotion in an individual or a group? Is that what's really going on behind the scenes in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So obviously this isn't a book about dating, but just to stick on the dating theme for just a minute, many of these dating apps do not allow you to browse. They just give you the algorithmic recommendations, and you can either say yes or no, swipe left or swipe right. And so the entire pool from which you are choosing is algorithmically curated. So it's impossible for the algorithm to not have an effect on the outcomes. And so that's also true in a lot of the other elements of the news we read, the products we buy, the opinions we form, and so on. And frequently, these algorithms are designed by engineers who not only have no purview onto the societal implications of their designs, but aren't incentivized to think about those things to begin with. So, for instance, in the book, I tell the story of, there are two major algorithms in the hype machine, the social media industrial complex. One of them is the newsfeed algorithms that you see in every platform, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter. The feed of information is sorted and curated by algorithms. And the other one is what's known as friend suggestion or people you may know algorithms, which essentially curate for you recommendations on who you should connect with next in the network. So the friend recommendation algorithms are essentially determining the social network, the digital social network of humanity, And the newsfeed algorithms are determining the flow of information over that network, two really important problems. And when you look at the way that the friend recommendation algorithms are designed, what you find is that it's a very difficult problem to, for instance, if you're a Facebook engineer, take the 3 billion people who are on Facebook and recommend to each of them which of the 3 billion other people they should connect with next in the network. That's a very challenging engineering problem to sort out. And one really easy shortcut is to just recommend friends of friends, people who are connected to people you're already connected with. And what engineers found in designing these algorithms is that when you create that constraint and you recommend friends of friends in a very high proportion or almost exclusively, those recommendations are taken up much more often. In other words, people say yes to friends of friends much more often than non-friend of friend recommendations. And so that's a very efficient engineering shortcut through the problem of who to recommend next in terms of who to connect to, but it has massive societal implications that probably weren't considered when the algorithms were being designed, which is that it creates clusters of very similar people that are more connected to each other than you would find in a natural world. And that has implications on polarization, on the degree to which homophily or birds of a feather flocking together, people who are like themselves being friends online, how that is in places like Facebook compared to the natural world. And so that also has implications for the degree to which you get a diversity of opinions in your life, the degree to which you are fed information that essentially supports the worldview that you already have or gives you counter-attitudinal information. And that has lots of potential implications on political polarization, factionalization of society, and so on. But it all comes down to a simple engineering shortcut that just makes the code more efficient to run.
So what you're really saying, which I find a little scary, is that these engineering shortcuts and possibly other algorithms are creating the topology of the network, that is, who is connected to who, and then other algorithms kick in and decide what information to send over each link in this network. And the way I see it is this is all orchestrated according to, quote unquote, the objective function of the day that the operator of the network wants to optimize. I mean, it's like the operators have a bunch of dials they can tune accordingly, as in, let's crank up some new connections in Hong Kong and get some buzz flowing across them. The larger implications of these externalities are someone else's problem. Personally, as amazing as these platforms are in terms of how they've enriched and transformed our lives, these unknown unknowns, these externalities resulting from the design choices of their operators are someone else's problem. That's a little scary.
Yeah. I mean, it's scary, but also empowering, right? So in two ways. First of all, the larger global consequence of this factionalization that I describe is what people have referred to recently as the Splinter Net. So imagine a world in which across national borders, you have dramatic differences in the networks and in the information that's flowing over the networks. We know, for instance, that, China has a completely different set of apps and internets and algorithms than the rest of the world. They have the Great Firewall. They have substitutes for Facebook and other apps like WeChat and so on. We know that, India banned TikTok. We know that the US tried to ban TikTok and it was blocked at the district court level. Well, imagine a world in which you have very different networks and information algorithms in different parts of the world, and you start to realize that this creates very different worldviews because the citizens of those factions across borders have access to very different information. And we know that social media has a lot to do with the perception of the world, or sort of the information that we have about the world. And we've got a lot of global challenges that are going to require collaboration and cooperation across borders. And any student of negotiation knows that one of the primary ingredients to effective and healthy collaboration and cooperation is what's known as common ground. So the less common ground we have, the less we can agree on a certain set of realities. And the more reality is factionalized across different elements of the Splinter Net, the much harder it becomes to deal with global challenges like climate change or migration or et cetera, because each set of citizens in a country has its own worldviews, and the politicians are essentially responding to those worldviews in that locality.
What's your sense of how politicians are responding, right? So how are politicians and governments responding, right? Because when I look at the US, when I look at India, I look at China, Europe, very different responses and concerns, right, that are driven by how these societies are structured, right? I mean, you're going to say something, so go ahead.
Well, I mean, you noted that we have a bunch of externalities, and these externalities are not priced in very well to a typical free market set of decision-making norms, because, the platforms don't bear the cost of harmful speech. They don't bear the cost of a loss of privacy to their citizens. They don't bear the cost of the spread of misinformation, whether it's in elections or whether it's public health misinformation about the coronavirus. And so where you have these externalities that are not priced in to the quote unquote polluter, say, then you have what's known as a market failure. And so government becomes essential, because that is essentially the role of government in a free market capitalist society, is to deal with market failure. And you deal with market failure through things like regulation. And so what you see just last week is two diametrically opposed approaches to this problem just in Europe and the United States. Put aside China, which has its completely different approach, right? In the world, for instance, just on privacy, you have three regimes worldwide. You have China, which is essentially a surveillance state. You have Europe, which is heavily, focused on privacy with the GDPR, which is the general directive on privacy. And then you have the United States that's still trying to figure out where it wants to land on privacy. On competition, just last week, you saw two completely diametrically opposed approaches in Europe and the United States. In the United States, you saw the FTC and many attorneys general of the states of the United States bring two antitrust actions against Facebook, where the FTC complaint had three basic arguments: that the WhatsApp acquisition was anti-competitive, the Instagram acquisition was anti-competitive, and the use of the APIs were anti-competitive. And so the solution or the remedy from the US government's perspective is break up Facebook. Whereas in Europe, what you see is a legislative approach. So they passed the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act in the European Commission last week, just announced, where they're going to regulate the way that the quote unquote gatekeepers, the Facebooks of the world as they define them, are providing access to their platforms, the way they are being competitive or not being competitive, being able to fine them up to 10% of their total global revenue for violations of the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act and so on. That's a legislative approach. Whereas in the United States, you have this antitrust legal approach designed to sort of break up Facebook. And of course, in my book, I take a very strong position on which of these is the right approach.
So which of them is the right approach? I'm not, convinced one way or the other that I really buy that anyone knows the approach. And by the way, part of this is because I think we don't even know what the externalities are, right? In the case of General Electric throwing arsenic into the Hudson River, well, you know what the externality is. But the trouble is that we don't even know all the potential things that are going on under the hood. without our knowledge, we have concerns, but we're not fully aware of, what all these externalities are. But coming back to your question, which is the better approach in your view?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that the broad answer to this, how do we solve the social media crisis that we find ourselves in, which I advocate in my book, is that we have to stop armchair theorizing about how social media works and really get under the hood with scientific research, which we've been doing for 15 years now, publishing very large-scale studies about how it all works, all of which is detailed in my book. And I think that once we pay attention to the details of the true rigor under the hood about how it works, we do know what the externalities are. We know, for instance, that major things that we have to deal with are privacy, the spread of harmful speech, and drawing the boundaries between free speech and harmful speech. I'm a big free speech advocate, a big believer in the First Amendment being fundamental to democracy. But I also believe that there are times when there need to be limits. In the case of harmful speech, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And there are moments where the First Amendment contravenes the 14th Amendment protection against equal protection, right? We have, laws that ratchet up penalties for crimes that are accompanied by hate speech and so on. So we need to know where to draw that line. The spread of misinformation is another externality. Election integrity and social media manipulation of elections is another externality. Each of these are very well known, and there are ways to deal with them. And, one thing I'll say, and then I'll get to your question about competition and which one is the right solution. There's been a lot of books and movies about social media recently. So you have great books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff or Zucked by Roger McNamee. You have the Social Dilemma movie, which is a very hot documentary on Netflix. But before that, you had The Great Hack, which is about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, a documentary on Netflix. Well, my book is designed to take off where these books and movies leave off, which is to ask, what do we do? What can we concretely do? In the sense that these books and movies raise the red flag, the clarion call that we have a crisis in social media, but they don't necessarily provide any answers. And so my book is designed to take off where they leave off and to say, what can we concretely do to fix the social media morass that we find ourselves in? And I take each one of those externalities, those market failures in turn and describe how we might navigate through them. When it comes to competition, I have a very clear position in the book, which is that breaking up Facebook is not going to solve the competition problem in social media. And the reason for that is because the social economy runs on network effects, which, as you know, means that the sort of power and value of a given platform is a function of the number of users that it has on the platform. And those underlying market economics, economies that run on network effects, tend towards concentration and monopolization. And if you break up the market leader without structural reforms to the economy itself, it will just tip the next Facebook-like company into market dominance because network effects drive towards concentration. So what we really need are structural reforms to the economy itself. And those structural reforms essentially include interoperability legislation and social network and data portability. And I'll tell you what I mean. Interoperability legislation would force, through legislation, the platforms to become interoperable. And there's the Access Act that's sitting before Congress now, which would force any social media platform greater than 100 million users to become interoperable with the other social media platforms. And the analogy of that is the Time Warner merger. With the Time Warner merger, we forced AOL's Instant Messenger, AIM, to become interoperable with Yahoo Messenger and MSN Messenger. And at the time, AOL was the clear market leader. They had 65% market share in instant messaging. And after we forced them to become interoperable, they went to 59% market share the next year, 55% the year after that. And then 3 years later, they ceded the entire market to new entrants. So interoperability can create competition. Social network portability and data portability gives consumers choices for which platform to adopt. And in doing so, forces the platforms to give consumers a clean and free environment. And the analogy there is number portability. It used to be you couldn't take your cell phone number with you from one service provider to another. Then we legislated that you had to enable people to take their cell phone number with them from Verizon to Sprint, say. And at the time, that was people's social networks because those numbers where everyone knew to call you. That was how you connected with your social network. And research shows that when number portability was instituted in the European Union, for example, by law, it created $880 million of consumer surplus every quarter for years and years and years because it enabled competition. So what we really need are structural reforms to the social media economy. Breaking up any given company doesn't provide a sustainable, long-lasting solution. And I'll say one other thing, which is that the way that platforms that run on network effects create value, consumer surplus, and value to society is by enabling connections. If you tear those connections apart by breaking up a company without forcing them to be interoperable, you actually destroy a lot of consumer value.
So how about something even simpler? I'm just curious to get your take on this, right? One of the things we often talk about is the need for greater transparency. Why not just force social media companies to operate like financial institutions that are just required to record everything, right? So anytime they may send you a friend suggestion and close a triangle in your language, they record it. That doesn't mean they need to give away the secret sauce as to how they decided to make that recommendation. But why don't we just require them to, just record everything? I guess what I call the credible threat theory of regulation, so that they become a little more responsible, right? Because so far they've just been operating in the dark. No one knows what the hell they do. They're free to do anything, and they've been, functioning like a bunch of bandits. And I don't blame them, right? That they can get away with it, they will. As long as they satisfy shareholders, which is their primary responsibility, they will do this. So why not just, and by the way, this same thing happened in banking. Banks behaved really badly in the 80s and 90s. Lots of dealers were fined for all kinds of illegal activity. But the requirement that, you really had to record transactions. And, there's a reason our financial system is the most trusted in the world, right? There is that degree of transparency. So, before we go down the road of requiring all of these other things, which I think are great ideas, I think the interoperability is a great idea. The number portability concept is a real idea. But why not just do some basic blocking and tackling first? And require transparency in the form of we just require you to record everything you do. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a huge advocate for exactly that, transparency, and it's written throughout the book. But I'll take you a step further, which is I think what we need is both transparency and choice. So, for instance, in the algorithm, we started with the AI concept and the notion of the algorithms that are running the social media economy. What I'd like to see is a lot of transparency around exactly how those algorithms work and what the consequences are of those algorithms, and to give the consumer a suite of algorithmic options and let them choose which algorithm they want running their newsfeed. So instead of saying, well, you get the Facebook algorithm and that runs your newsfeed, say, here's a radial button dial. You can choose between these 5 algorithms, one that favors diversity more, one that favors, more of, what you like, one that favors, some randomness, and to not only make them transparent, but then to also give consumers choices among those algorithms. I strongly advocate both of those things. We need both. We need algorithmic transparency. We need more algorithmic choice. We need to be able to put these algorithms in a Skinner box, as Iyad Rowan likes to say, where we can actually kick the tires on them and see how they respond to data of different kinds and what the implications are. And we need scientists to report to society about what each algorithm is doing and why and so on, and then to give consumers choice. And obviously, you don't have to give the sort of the secret sauce, as it were. You just need to be able to define the contours of how one algorithm behaves differently than another, and then allow consumers to choose. So transparency and choice.
Wow, there's a lot in there. I want to come back to where we started. And I said, what you're saying sounds really scary. And, I have concerns, but, I'm an optimist. And I believe that, despite the fact that the technology's gotten away from us and led to all kinds of unintended consequences that we're looking at now in, sometimes a little bit of horror, sometimes with some degree of concern, that, we've recognized the problem. And so I guess I feel optimistic that we will somehow correct it. How do you feel? Are you optimistic that, that these are serious problems, but they are, addressable, despite what we started off with earlier, namely that you have a bunch of engineers making decisions that have all kinds of consequences that we don't understand. And I guess what I'm really trying to get to is we need to understand the consequences of those choices that those people are making and see what kinds of failures it's leading to, right? In your language, right? You talked about the fact that, laws come into the picture to address failures. And we've seen some failures. We've seen failures in terms of sort of the election outcomes. And by the way, when I talk about externalities that we may not be even aware of, I'm talking about, let's say, teen depression. One of the things I hear from high school counselors is an increasing amount of depression among teens. And now, we don't have sufficient data, but I think there is reason to be concerned. And those are the kinds of externalities I'm talking about. Maybe these algorithms closing triangles all day as a side effect is leading to teen depression. And no one even knows it except Facebook. I mean, no one even can answer the question or have the data to answer it except Facebook, unless we have some degree of transparency where we can go back to that data a few years down, later and say, let's do the science, which is what you were referring to. Let's do the science properly and see what's really going on. And so the optimist in me says, I think we can solve these problems because the first step to solving them is to recognize them. And we've recognized some of them. And so how do you feel about that? Are you similarly optimistic?
Yeah. So another big difference between this book and a lot of the books and movies you'll see out there is that it tries to really be even-handed about the situation that we find ourselves in. So we went through a decade of techno-utopianism, where these platforms were going to connect the world, and it was kumbaya, and it was meaningful human connection and life-saving information and so on. Then we went into a decade now of techno-dystopianism, where Facebook is destroying democracy and destroying the world and so on. Well, I think that, neither of these stories is complete. And I talk in the book about what I call the promise and the peril, that we can't forget the tremendous promise of social media. And we certainly can't, ignore the potential peril that we face in terms of democracy or coronavirus misinformation and so on. But we have to get past this notion of whether social media is good or evil. The answer is yes. There is both promise and peril in technologies like this. And I am very optimistic that we can actually achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril. And in fact, this book is about how we do that. How do we achieve social media's promise while avoiding its peril? That's what this book is about. And I remind people in the book about all of the amazing things that social media does in society and for us in ways that we might have forgotten. So just to give you a couple of examples, when Nepal had its greatest earthquake in 100 years, Facebook spun up a donate now button and donated more than Europe and the US combined in relief efforts, from 770,000 individual donations from 140 countries. People like to make fun of the Ice Bucket Challenge, but it raised $250 million for ALS research in 8 weeks. That is the sort of mobilizing potential of social media. Don't forget, social movements. Black Lives Matter in the United States, the founders of Black Lives Matter say that the Black Lives Matter movement could not exist without social media. And before Black Lives Matter, it was the Arab Spring and the Snow Revolution in Russia, and it was protest movements in Hong Kong and Ukraine. And as I describe in the book, there is power and fragility in social movements that are born and catalyzed and accelerated by social media. And we have to be realistic about the potential, the promise of the technology, as well as the peril. Research that we've done, I'm the director of MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy, and research that we've done at the IDE, as well as has been done at Stanford, shows that Facebook creates $370 billion in consumer surplus every year in the United States alone. And it is much bigger globally than it is in the United States. And in some countries, Facebook is the internet. So in the Philippines, Facebook is the internet. In parts of Africa, Facebook is the internet. And the value that it creates is in access to jobs, access to reskilling and retraining, access to life-saving health information and meaningful human connection. And many people run their small and medium-sized businesses completely on Facebook, and it provides a ton of opportunity. So we can't forget the promise. We can't ignore the peril. This book is about how do we achieve the promise while avoiding the peril. We really have to get down into the details and the nuance of it all instead of armchair theorizing about how it works and how we fix it.
Indeed. In fact, it would be great to get numbers on the peril side as well, right? I mean, you noted some numbers on the promise side. The trouble is that we don't know the numbers on the peril side, and that's part of the problem that we're dealing with here.
We know some numbers which are frightening, but we haven't been able to get access to the data needed to really definitively catalog the potential peril. So I'll give you one example. Social media's effect on elections. Okay, we know a lot about it, but we don't know enough. So for instance, we know that in 2016, it's too close into the 2020 election to talk about a postmortem about interference in the 2020 election. But in 2016, Russia sent manipulative messages to 126 million people on Facebook, 20 million on Instagram, 10 million tweets from accounts with 6 million followers on Twitter, and 43 hours of YouTube content in just the months leading up to the election. We know all of that. What we don't know is what effect this had on voting or voting outcomes. Research shows that social media has very little effect, and digital marketing has very little effect on vote choice. In fact, it's unlikely that it's going to change anyone's vote from one candidate to another or insufficient numbers to affect an election. But we also know through large-scale experiments that it has a big effect on voter turnout. And that's where a lot of the manipulative messages were. It was about suppressing votes of the African American community. We know, for instance, that over 90% of the misinformation spread over Instagram during the 2016 election was to suppress voter turnout in the African American community and other minority communities. What effect did this have on voter turnout? That's a much scarier question. And that's just one of the quote unquote externalities that we're talking about. We need a lot more research, but we do know some things on the negative side in terms of numbers.
By the way, since we're talking about that, and this is something, I proposed myself, I just want to get your take on it. Would a requirement to know your user deal with a lot of these problems we're having, where people just feel like they can misbehave and say whatever they want and spread fake news? There's several things you talk about in your book, namely that it's very difficult to tell real from fake, right? And very often, persuasion is based on sort of mixing the two in the right way, right? And I guess it would be nice to have something in place that keeps that kind of thing in check. And to some extent, I would argue that the ability to hide behind something, by the way, I'm not proposing that get rid of anonymity, but I'm just saying that what if you were really required to identify yourself to a platform? And you can use a pseudonym, right? But wouldn't that kind of transparency and know your user as opposed to know your customer, with the customers being the advertisers who are paying Facebook, shouldn't these platforms really go for complete transparency in terms of like who we're dealing with here, who's paying us, and who are the people on this platform that are participating and, spreading information? Nothing wrong with that. But it seems to me that some people on these platforms are riskier than others. Like most people are there to like talk about apple pie or whatever, but there's people there with an agenda, right? And as long as these people can hide, and I would argue the social media platforms have let them do that because it's been in their interest to do that, right? You're going to get this bad behavior, right? Why not just and I come back to the sort of basic blocking and tackling, which is just make things transparent, make people accountable, right? We live in a democracy. We have rights, we have freedoms, we can say whatever we want, but there's also a reciprocal obligation to be a good citizen, right? And it seems to me that it's important in this day and age of social media to be able to do that because the implications are huge.
Yeah, I mean, to comment on what you started with, which is this, the falsity and the mixing of truth with falsity and that becoming very persuasive. We did this very large study, which we published on the cover of Science in 2018 on the spread of true and false news online, a 10-year study of all of the tweets on Twitter from verified true and false news. And what we found was there was this really interesting category of mixed news, which actually played a very important role in the annexation of Crimea, which, as you know, is the story that opens the book. So that cloaking falsity in a cloak of truth is a really dangerous way to sort of insert falsity into what seems more convincing conversation. And when it comes to identity and anonymity, I think, Facebook has certainly moved more in this direction. They have done a lot to sort of purge fake accounts in the last 3 to 4 years, I would say. There's a counter argument, which is that in some countries, this notion of a lack of anonymity really, especially in authoritarian regimes, makes it very difficult for minority opinions to be expressed without retribution. And so if you are really making everything completely identified and identifying everything, there are two extremes here: complete anonymity, where it's a free-for-all and people have no accountability for what they're saying online, and then complete transparency, where everybody knows everything about who's saying what and so on. In authoritarian regimes, it can be a problem for minority expression because that transparency is followed by retribution and or putting dissenting opinions, suppressing minority opinions and dissenting opinions and so on. So I think we have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes a little bit of privacy can be important to minority expression. And again, what I call in the book, and what I did an interview with a journalist named Martin Giles back in 2018, in which I described this notion of the transparency paradox, which is that we are asking these platforms to simultaneously be more transparent and more secure at the same time. And that's exactly the needle that they have had to thread since 2018, because we want to know, we want them to reveal everything, but we also understand that privacy is also an important set of values in a democracy, not just because of their utilitarian and deontological values in terms of privacy itself, but because sometimes privacy can support the expression of minority opinion, especially in authoritarian countries where that's really important to preserve minority opinion.
So, I'm all for privacy, but if we ignore, let's say, China for a minute, right, and talk about democracies, I'm not suggesting that you be transparent. I mean, pseudonyms are fine. All I'm saying is that to the platform, you should be identifiable. Because otherwise we get the sort of whack-a-mole behavior, right? The Kenosha incident that Facebook took a lot of flack for. A group comes up, Facebook shuts it down, it comes up again, right? And so it's this, you get the feeling that it's, Facebook's like doing something because they need to show that they're doing something and they're acting responsibly. But I don't get the sense that that they're solving the problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, I fully endorse more transparency and as well more individual users, citizens, consumers control over their own data. Both of those two things I advocate for strongly in the book. I just think we have to be aware. So every time I hear a suggestion, like for instance, universal IDs on social media, I always think, what is the drawback? What's the danger of that? Well, the danger of universal identification is minority suppression in authoritarian regimes. People say, oh, well, we should just have subscription models because then the ad model would go away and that would solve the whole obsession with engagement. And then my response to that is, well, one, I don't think it would solve the obsession with engagement because you still need people engaged in order to justify a subscription price, right? Secondly, a subscription model would bring inequality to the value that's created by social media. Now only people who could afford all of that information, life-saving health information and access to jobs and reskilling and retraining, the $370 billion in consumer surplus that's created in the United States every year, only people rich enough to afford the subscription could actually get access to that or run their business off of Facebook and so on. There are always drawbacks. And I think we have to be nuanced about each of these choices that we're making. But at a 30,000 foot level, I strongly advocate for transparency and as well consumers having more decision rights in their own data.
Let's come back to something we were talking about earlier, which is all of these lawsuits that are suddenly cropping up against, Facebook, Google. Like, what do you think? Do you think that the Justice Department just made a mistake in approving, the acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp? And, at that time, the threat didn't seem quite as severe as it seems now. Did they just make a mistake? Do these lawsuits really hold any water, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that the case against Facebook is a much harder uphill climb than people realize, mainly because the mergers received a great deal of scrutiny and oversight at the time they were approved, and the government took a look at them and approved them. And then, 8-10 years later, you're going to say, wait a minute, now you poured hundreds of billions of dollars into these companies, and the mergers that we approved, now we're going to call them anti-competitive. And of course, at the time when they approved the mergers, they left themselves some wiggle room and said, we reserve the right to revisit this later. But what kind of a chilling message does that send to the business community that the government could conduct their oversight, approve a merger, and then 8 years later or 10 years later say, oh, actually, that merger was anti-competitive, and now we're going to punish you for it? I think that's a big, big hurdle for this case. Secondly, I think that these cases, quote unquote, as you call them, are all very different from one another. We tend to want to package them up under the banner of breaking up big tech. But the antitrust cases against Amazon and Google and even Apple are very different than the antitrust case against Facebook. And I think that we need to talk about each one of them as a separate question rather than...
Good. Yeah, good point. I'm glad you said that. So then let's talk about Google, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me that with Google, the primary cases against them playing multiple roles in the digital ad marketplace, as market maker, as buyer, as seller. And in financial markets, we would never allow that, right? That the roles are really clearly defined. You can't put yourself ahead in the queue and things like that. Whereas the digital marketplace has been so opaque, and dark compared to the financial marketplace, which has the lights shining on it, double bright, so that if there's any sort of even a hint of wrongdoing, the regulators can converge on you super quick. Whereas the digital ad marketplace just seems like such a poorly understood space. And it seems to me that, based on the little that I've been able to glean, and I've, looked at this, fairly hard, that it seems to be about manipulation of the ad marketplace. Yeah. And to me, that seems like a reasonable place to start. If in fact they're playing multiple roles and giving themselves preferential treatment, well, that's not right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably the clearest argument that the government has. I think it's actually easier to understand in the case of Amazon, which is to say that if you're going to sell Amazon basic products and you're going to control the algorithm that recommends products as well, and then you're going to have other suppliers of those same exact products compete against your products in the marketplace that you control, it's what Elizabeth Warren creates an analogy to being the ref and having a team in the game at the same time, right? And that's, I think, a much clearer and cleaner argument to make than the argument about mergers that were approved 8 to 10 years ago already by government oversight. And that's a very different argument. So I think in the case of Google and Amazon being the controller of the marketplace and as well being a player in the marketplace is a different argument. And I think it has a bit more credibility, to be totally honest with you, in terms of an antitrust argument.
Yeah, seems that way to me. And while we're talking about this, let's just close the loop and consider the other giant in the room, which is Apple. Is the case against them fairly strong? I mean, this notion of an app store 30%, if they charged 15, would that be different? Like, what's the case there?
I mean, I think that there is a commonality between the Apple case and the Amazon case of owning the store and selling products in the store as well, and being sort of the gatekeeper and extracting too high of a tax in order to have access to the marketplace and so on. These arguments are potentially, in my mind, a little bit more convincing because we want free and open markets, and I'm not a big fan, I don't want your listeners to get the impression that I'm somehow, a big fan of government regulation and or government intervention. I'm not. I do believe, however, that there are some very clear market failures in the case of Facebook where we need legislation, whether it's privacy, whether it's election integrity. There are lots of specific pieces of legislation that I discuss in the book that I think would help the market failures on the social media side in terms of Facebook, and the social media economy. But that said, I think that in terms of antitrust, while the arguments against Facebook, I think, are weaker, I think there are some reasonable arguments to be made in terms of some of these marketplaces.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess if I try and wrap up what you're saying, it's really these three kinds of market failures, in terms of privacy, elections, and, running free and fair marketplaces, which, we expect in the physical world and which we should also expect in the electronic world.
And I would add the two other market failures. One, which is this notion of harmful speech, right? We don't want terrorist attacks live streamed over Facebook.
Right. So on that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but so there's really nothing wrong with inflammatory speech, right? There's nothing wrong with inflammatory speech, with fake stuff, like all of that is perfectly okay. We've had this in the physical world, for ages. So should we be really trying to clamp down on trying to determine whether something is true or fake? Why not just let it be and let the accountability and transparency sort that out?
Well, I don't think that we should have laws against false information spreading on social media. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a sort of tyrannical bent to writing laws that contravene speech. I'm a huge free speech advocate. I think that, and as you read in my book, the solutions to the spread of misinformation online are not legal. I don't think that we need legal solutions to that. We need platform solutions to that. But there is a sense in which we need regulation to sort of guardrails around, for instance, political speech or foreign money in our elections. And we have a lot of those laws. They're just not being applied to social media. That's why the Honest Ads Act, which would simply, transfer what we've already regulated in terms of television, political advertising on television and radio, to also apply basically to Facebook, and why legislation around election integrity, where we would get transparency around foreign money going into political campaigns, why that kind of stuff is important. I don't believe that we should be passing laws about misinformation online. I think free speech is much more important than that. And in my book, I describe essentially that we have 4 levers with which to fix the social media economy. And those 4 levers are money, code, norms, and laws, where money is the business models of the social media platforms that create the incentives for how the advertisers, users, and the platforms behave on social media. Code is the design of the platforms as well as the algorithms that run the platforms. Norms is how we as consumers, as human beings, adopt and use the technology. We can't abdicate our own responsibility for how we're behaving online. And then finally is laws, regulation in the right places, but I'm not sort of a government can fix all of this sort of person.
So let's try and wrap all this up. So, we've seen these 2 Senate subcommittee hearings in the last few months. If you take that all in, what do you think is the most pressing thing lawmakers should be focusing on at the moment when it comes to digital platforms? And I know there isn't one solution to, different platforms because they're different and they've resulted in different kinds of externalities and market failures. How would you prioritize, right? So if you were one of those senators, how would you prioritize things? What's most important right now? What's most pressing? And what can we leave off for a little bit?
Well, I think that let's just focus on social media. So let's put aside Amazon and Apple. Let's just focus on the social media economy, which is Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, WeChat, Snapchat, that kind of, which is what the book is about, rather than Google, Apple, and Amazon. And in terms of social media, I really think that the key conversations that we need to be having are around competition, which would be interoperability legislation, data portability, social network portability. Then speech, really, which is the main conversation to be had there is any reform of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides these platforms a shield from civil liability in terms of their content moderation. And then laws around election integrity. So, the Voting System Cybersecurity Act or the Secure Our Democracy Act, the FIRE Act, those types of things around election integrity. So I think that those 3 areas, competition, speech, and democracy, writ large, are the 3 major areas. And in the book, I call for a national commission on democracy and technology, similar to the Warren Commission, where you would bring together experts from industry, scientists, academic researchers, journalists, activists, and so on, to really think about what the best path forward is to achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril. We need that national commission, and we need to address competition, speech, and democracy as the top 3 concerns with social media.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Sinan. I'm not sure where the time went, but I'm seeing, it's been an hour already, and it's been a fascinating conversation. So thanks for the time, and thanks for coming on the platform. Any parting words before we call it a day?
Well, I really appreciate you having me. I think that we need to have this conversation more often with, more loudly over and over again. And so I welcome having this conversation with as many people as will have it with me. And I really look forward to continuing it with you and all of your colleagues and listeners as well.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Sinan. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and we will talk again soon.
Great to talk to you.
Likewise.